Her behaviour, the way she'd act like animals, for one. Finding a bird's nest and she killed 2 birds just straight across with stones, and I was crying my eyes out and she wasn't even asked. The mice that she had that she just stamped on.
Case 1. Blake and Tristan. Sheffield, England, 2019. The first case begins in a terrace house in a quiet suburb of Sheffield called Sky Green. May 24, 2019. Police and paramedics arrived to find a scene almost beyond belief. 2 teenage boys, Blake and Tristan, dead. 4 younger children, narrowly surviving a coordinated attempt on their lives. The perpetrators were their own mother, Sarah Barrass, and her half-brother, Brandon Machin. And the motive was a secret, so corrosive that the family's destruction had felt, to those who knew them, almost inevitable. WHO Sarah Barrass was. Sarah Barrass was 35 years old in May 2019. Her own upbringing had been marked by chaos, neglect, and unaddressed trauma. She suffered from learning disabilities that were never properly treated, drifting through life on the margins. But her most dangerous secret was her relationship with Machin, her half-brother, and the father of her children. The incestuous nature of their partnership cast a shadow over the entire family, a secret that both feared would come to light. By the spring of 2019, that fear had grown into something suffocating. Social services were beginning to take an interest in the welfare of the children. Rumors and questions about the true nature of the family's situation were swirling. The couple became convinced that authorities would separate them from their children, placing the youngsters in foster care, and expose the truth behind their relationship. Instead of seeking help, they chose the unthinkable. The night of May 24th. The plan was set in motion in the early hours. Sarah and Brandon first attempted to kill all 6 children by administering poisonous substances. When the poison failed to take immediate effect on Blake and Tristan, the 2 teenagers were suffocated, one after the other. The couple then turned their attention to the 4 younger siblings, attempting to drown them in a bathtub. By sheer luck and quick intervention, those 4 survived. Oh, what investigators found when they entered that house was almost beyond processing. What made the case even more disturbing was the evidence that followed. Digital evidence on Sarah's phone showed text messages between her and Brandon, mapping out their plan in harrowing detail. These were not the actions of people in a momentary panic. This was deliberate, methodical, communicated step by step. Sarah would later admit to the court, "I gave life and I can take it away." She framed the children's deaths as a twisted act of protection, saving them from what she imagined would be a worse fate at the hands of the authorities. The verdict. Sarah Barrass and Brandon Machin pleaded guilty to multiple counts, including murder and attempted murder. Mr. Justice Goss addressed Barrass directly from the bench. "Your belief that you gave life did not entitle you to take it away." Sarah Barrass was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 35 years. Brandon Machin received the same. WHO Blake and Tristan were. Blake and Tristan were remembered by friends and neighbors as bright, kind-hearted boys with their futures ahead of them. One family friend described the loss as a huge, empty void in the community. The surviving children, now living under new identities, carry scars, emotional and physical, that may never truly heal. What makes the Barrass case so haunting isn't just the violence. It is the motive behind it. A mother so terrified of losing her children to the care system that she chose to end their lives rather than face the truth. The most profound dangers can sometimes come from within the family itself, hidden behind walls of secrecy and fear. When fear becomes stronger than love, everything it sought to protect can be destroyed. Case 2. LEXI and SCARLET. Rugby, England, 2018. The next case takes us to Rugby, England. January 2018. Louise Porton was 23 years old, and she stood accused of the unthinkable, deliberately ending the lives of her own daughters. 3-year-old Lexi, 17-month-old Scarlett. The motive: a chilling belief that her children were obstacles standing between her and the social life she wanted for herself. WHO Louise Porton was born in 1996, raised in Rugby. Louise Porton came from a seemingly ordinary family. But by her early 20s, she was caught between two worlds: her personal pursuits and her responsibilities as a mother. Time and again, she made choices that put her own needs far above the welfare of her daughters. In January 2018, that pattern took a fatal turn. The deaths. On two separate occasions less than 3 weeks apart, Porton's young daughters were found unresponsive. Lexi had been hospitalized previously for unexplained breathing difficulties. Each time doctors struggled to find a medical explanation. The pattern was alarming. After both girls died in such rapid succession, authorities began to suspect the worst. Medical experts determined that both Lexi and Scarlett had suffered airway obstruction. Their deaths could not be explained by natural causes alone. The truth was impossible to ignore. The girls had been suffocated by the very person meant to protect them. The digital footprint. Porton's behavior during this period only deepened suspicion. Rather than grieving, she continued to pursue new relationships, frequently using dating apps, exchanging messages with men, even as her daughters lay in hospital beds. Social media posts documented nights out and flirtatious exchanges with barely a mention of her children's health crisis. Friends and acquaintances described her as cold, detached, and oddly unaffected. But it was Louise's digital footprint that finally exposed her crimes. In the days leading up to both Lexi's and Scarlett's deaths, Porton conducted chilling online searches. Questions about how long it takes for a child to die from drowning. The mechanics of airway obstruction. These searches, made just hours before each incident, would prove to be the key evidence in building the prosecution's case. She searched for how to do it. Then she did it. The trial and verdict. The trial gripped the nation for 5 weeks in the summer of 2019. Prosecutors described a young woman so consumed by her own desires that she viewed her daughters not as children, but as inconveniences. Louise Porton squeezed the life out of Lexi and Scarlett, simply to free herself for the life she wanted. In August 2019, the verdict came down. Louise Porton was convicted of 2 counts of murder, sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 32 years before she is eligible for parole. Judge Yip addressed Porton directly. "You have squeezed the life out of your daughters for your own convenience." The girl's father, Chris, stood in court and asked Louise the questions that everyone else was thinking. "Why are you so evil? Were they just an inconvenience to you?" For Lexi and Scarlett, there would be no answers. Only the tragedy of lost childhoods and a family forever marked by betrayal. The line between inconvenience and tragedy was crossed, with fatal consequences.
Guilty. Did you expect that?
I mean, obviously I knew that's a possibility, yeah. So it was a bit of a surprise, actually.
What made you surprised that it went that direction?
I mean, I shouldn't be surprised.
Case 3. TYLEE and JJ, Idaho and Arizona, 2019-2020. The next case spans 2 American states, rooted in twisted faith and an obsession with the end of days. Lori Vallow Daybell, once an ordinary mother, became infamous as the woman at the heart of a deadly doomsday cult. Missing children, secret graves, a chilling belief that family could become the enemy. WHO Lori Vallow was raised in California in Mormon communities. Lori Vallow moved through a string of marriages, each more turbulent than the last. Everything changed when she met Chad Daybell, a fringe religious author and podcaster obsessed with prophecies, the afterlife, and a coming apocalypse. Together, Lori and Chad spiraled into a world of dark visions, convinced they alone understood the battle between light and dark spirits. The cult's teachings went far beyond ordinary faith. According to their beliefs, some people could become zombies. their souls replaced by evil entities, their bodies nothing more than shells that could not be saved, and had to be destroyed. In the eyes of Lori and Chad, their own children had been branded as dark spirits. 16-year-old Tylee Ryan, 7-year-old Joshua JJ Vallow. Oh, their own children. The search. By late 2019, alarm bells were sounding. Extended family and friends grew worried. No one had seen Tylee or JJ in weeks. Lori and Chad spun wild stories, claiming the kids were safe and happy. Their explanations never added up. JJ's grandmother, Kay Woodcock, desperate for answers, filed a missing persons report, pushing authorities to dig deeper. The investigation spanned states, crossing from Arizona to Idaho, unraveling a web of lies and secrecy. In June 2020, the search ended in horror. Police descended on Chad Daybell's property in rural Idaho. In the backyard, they uncovered the burned, dismembered remains of both Tylee and JJ, buried in shallow graves. The children, once seen as beloved family members, had been sacrificed to their parents' beliefs. The trial. In May 2023, Lori Vallow Daybell was convicted in Idaho on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and grand theft. That July, she was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. 2 years later, an Arizona court added further consecutive life sentences for related crimes. Chad Daybell still insists on his innocence. Kay Woodcock, JJ's grandmother, confronted Lori in court. "I trusted you," she said, her voice shaking with grief. The case became a modern cautionary tale, a warning about the dangers of unchecked belief, isolation, and the seductive power of apocalyptic thinking. How far will people go for their beliefs? And who pays the price when faith turns fatal? Stop right here. If you're still watching, you're about to hear 5 more cases. Pam Hupp's calculated murder-for-hire scheme in Missouri. Mitchell Blair's unimaginable secret in Detroit. Brittany Gosney's abandonment of her 6-year-old son in Ohio. Christiane K's methodical act in Germany. And Leilani Simon's elaborate deception in Savannah, Georgia. Most people click away before the 5th case. If you're about to leave, don't. Subscribe. Hit the bell. These children deserve to have their stories heard to the end. Like. Share. Type subscribed. Now, Missouri. Pam Hupp.
I want to find out what's going on with all these people coming at me. And I hit his arm with the knife and then shot out of the car and ran inside. He goes, "Bitch," we're going to the bank, we're getting Russ's money. And he started getting all agitated and excited.
2011 to 2016. The next case is different from those that came before, because the children who were destroyed by Pam Hupp were not her own. They were Betsy Faria's daughters, who lost their mother to a woman who had built a life out of deception and who would go on to murder again. WHO Pam Hupp was growing up in St. Louis. Pam Hupp presented to the world as hardworking, ambitious, a devoted wife and mother. But as investigators would later discover, Pam Hupp's real genius was not in building relationships. It was in tearing them down for her own benefit. The murder of Betsy Faria. The most notorious chapter of her story began with the murder of Betsy Faria in 2011. Betsy, a close friend of Pam's, was found stabbed to death in her own home, just days after signing over a $150,000 life insurance policy to Hupp. Despite the suspicious circumstances, Pam positioned herself as a helpful witness, casting suspicion onto Betsy's husband, Russ. Her calm testimony in court, and her insistence on Russ's guilt, helped convict him, only for that verdict to be overturned on appeal when new evidence came to light. By then, questions were swirling around Pam's role in the crime. The second murder, 2016. With the Faria case still under scrutiny, Pam Hupp concocted a plan to deflect suspicion once and for all. She targeted Louis Gumpenberger, a mentally and physically disabled man, luring him to her home with the promise of quick cash. According to her version of events, Gumpenberger burst into her home, threatened her, and was shot in self-defense. But police quickly discovered the holes in her story. The so-called home invasion was a setup from the beginning. Hupp had called a taxi to bring Gumpenberger to her home. She staged evidence to make it appear he was a hired killer sent by Russ Faria. She planted a note on his body. Investigators found that serial numbers on the bills given to Louis matched those withdrawn by Hupp. Cell phone records showed she had meticulously orchestrated the timing and location of every step. She lured a vulnerable disabled man to his death to redirect an investigation. The verdict. In June 2019, Pam Hupp entered an Alford plea for first-degree murder in the Gumpenberger case, meaning she maintained her innocence but acknowledged there was enough evidence to convict her. By August, she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. She now reportedly spends her days tutoring other inmates for their GEDs, still maintaining the polite, helpful exterior that fooled so many for so long. In 2025, Pam Hupp faces a retrial for the murder of Betsy Faria. For Betsy's daughters, who lost their mother when they were children, the case has never truly closed. The ripple effects of Pam's actions were felt for years, destroying families, upending the lives of children, exposing the fragility of trust in the justice system. Beneath the surface of ordinary life, there can lurk extraordinary darkness.
And I do not feel any remorse for what I did to Stony. So I grabbed Stephen and I grabbed a belt and I put a belt around his neck and I lifted him up like, do you like how this feels?
Case 5. Stephen and Stony, Detroit, 2012 to 2015. The next case takes us to Detroit. Behind the doors of a run-down apartment building, a secret festered for years. Mitchell Blair, a mother of 4, managed to hide the bodies of 2 of her own children in a freezer, carrying on with life while horror chilled in the next room. For 3 years, her secret remained buried, until an eviction finally forced the truth into the open. W.H.O. Mitchell Blair grew up in Detroit, surrounded by violence and instability. Her father was abusive, her mother enabling, patterns of pain that stretched from one generation to the next. By the time Blair became a mother herself, the cycle of trauma had already taken root. To outsiders, she appeared to be just another struggling single parent in a tough neighborhood. But behind closed doors, the situation was spiraling toward tragedy. Stephen. The story begins with Stephen, Blair's young son. In August 2012, Blair's anger and paranoia led her to target him. She became convinced, without evidence, that he had harmed his siblings. What followed was a campaign of brutal punishment that ended in Stephen's death. Blair made a decision that would stun even hardened detectives. She wrapped her son's body and placed him in the family freezer, sealing away the evidence. In her own guilt, life went on. Blair continued to raise her surviving children, keeping up a facade of normality. The freezer, now a tomb, became an unspoken boundary in the apartment. For 3 long years, no one questioned the missing child. No visits from authorities. No welfare checks. The dysfunction and secrecy that marked Blair's own childhood became the armor that shielded her from discovery. Stony. Then, in May 2015, tragedy struck again. This time, it was Stony, Blair's daughter. In another episode of rage, Blair claimed again without basis that Stony had harmed her siblings. She subjected Stony to prolonged abuse before finally ending her life, and repeating the same grim ritual, wrapping the body and placing it in the freezer beside her brother. The chilling gap between the 2 murders, 3 years, suggested something far more calculated than impulsive violence. The discovery, the facade finally shattered on March 24, 2015. With the family facing eviction, court officers entered the apartment to clear out the belongings. What they found inside the battered old freezer would haunt them for years. The remains of Stephen and Stony preserved in silence. News of the freezer murders stunned Detroit and the nation. Blair was arrested on the spot. During her interrogation, she showed little remorse, insisting she was the only one not lying. The verdict: Blair pleaded guilty in June 2015 to 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple charges of child abuse. Judge Dana Hathaway addressed Blair directly, noting the terrible fear endured by the surviving children. On July 17, 2015, Mitchell Blair was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The surviving siblings, once hostages to fear, have since been placed in stable care. As of 2025, they are reported to be doing well, finding healing and security that once seemed impossible in the shadows of their former home. That is the only light in this story: how the wounds of one childhood can be passed down, growing more dangerous with each repetition until something must break.
He came back and woke me up and he was like, "Do you know James is calling?" I was like, "What?" And I was like, "No, I thought he was upstairs asleep." Like, just pull off a little bit.
Just to scare him?
Yeah.
Case 6. James, Middletown, Ohio, February 26, 2021. A cold winter night, a small city outside Cincinnati, and a 6-year-old boy named James. Brittany, Gossney, and James Hamilton. Brittany Gossney, 29 years old, had spent years as a single mother of 3, moving from place to place, scraping by through evictions and periods of financial instability. By early 2021, she had entered a relationship with James Hamilton, a man who would become the driving force behind what happened next. Hamilton, frustrated by the demands of parenthood, pressured Brittany to get rid of the children. The idea began as talk. It soon became action. The night of February 26th, that evening, at Rush Run Wildlife Area, Gossney loaded James and his siblings into her car. The children had no idea what was coming. Once at the park, she told James to get out. As she pulled away, her son, confused and frightened, desperate not to be left alone, clung to the car door. Instead of stopping, Gossney accelerated, dragging James for hundreds of feet. By the time the car came to a halt, James had suffered fatal injuries. "Oh, family," he clung to the car door, and she accelerated. Instead of turning to authorities or seeking help, Brittany and Hamilton tried to cover up what had happened. They returned home, storing James's body in their house for hours before dumping him in the cold waters of the Ohio River. Days passed. Friends and family grew suspicious. Eventually, Brittany called police, claiming James had been kidnapped, a lie that quickly unraveled. When confronted with the facts, she finally broke down and told the truth. WHO James was. James's school principal, Tracy Neely, remembered him as a bright light, extinguished too soon. Teachers and classmates struggled to understand how a child so full of life and curiosity could meet such an abrupt and tragic end. The verdict: Brittany Gossney pleaded guilty in August 2021 to murder and multiple counts of endangering children. At sentencing in September, Butler County Prosecutor Michael G. Moser noted there was not one peep of sorry from Gossney, as the details of her actions were laid bare. She was sentenced to 21 years to life with the possibility of parole in 2042. His siblings were placed in the care of other family members, spared a similar fate, but left with scars that may never fully heal. How does external manipulation overpower the instincts that are supposed to bind a parent to their child? Case 7. 5 children. Solingen, Germany, September 3, 2020. On a quiet residential street, 5 children, ages 1 through 8, were found lifeless in their family apartment. And at the heart of this horror was a young mother, 28-year-old Christiane K., whose jealousy and desperation drove her to a crime that would stun an entire nation. Christiane K. had once seemed to be living a stable, if unremarkable, life. Raised in Solingen's working-class neighborhoods, she grew up without any signs of major trauma or abuse. Teachers and neighbors remembered her as ordinary. And for years, she built a family of her own, 5 young children, her days consumed by the routines of motherhood. But beneath the surface, things were beginning to unravel. The trigger was heartbreakingly simple. In the weeks leading up to September 2020, Christiane became increasingly isolated following a painful divorce. Her ex-partner had moved on. A single photograph showing him happy with a new girlfriend sent Christiane into a spiral. The morning of September 3rd, Christiane carried out a plan that stunned even seasoned detectives. She began by sedating her 5 youngest children, mixing medication into their breakfast. Then, in a chilling display of calculation, she systematically ended each of their lives, one by one. Only her eldest child, an 11-year-old, was spared. Christiane sent this child away to their grandmother, ensuring at least one member of her family would survive what she was about to do. She spared one. She planned which one. The methodical nature of the crime deeply unsettled investigators. There was no sign of a sudden loss of control. The acts were deliberate, planned. Christiane later attempted to stage the scene as the work of a masked intruder, even claiming to police that an unknown man was responsible. But forensic evidence and her own digital footprints quickly unraveled that story. The alarm was raised when Christiane's mother received a message from her granddaughter, the only survivor who had just arrived at her home. Sensing something was terribly wrong, the grandmother immediately alerted authorities. Police rushed to the apartment, discovering the 5 children. All drugged, all unable to defend themselves. Christiane herself survived a suicide attempt and was taken into custody shortly after. The trial and verdict. The trial began in the fall of 2021. Prosecutors described her actions as malicious and calculated, emphasizing how she had exploited the innocence and trust of her own children. On November 4, 2021, Christiane K. was found guilty of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of early parole for at least 15 years. The judge made it clear that her actions were a gross violation of maternal duty and trust. The surviving eldest child now lives with extended family, forever scarred by the events of that morning. In Solingen, memorials appeared outside the apartment block. Flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. How quickly jealousy and despair can destroy what matters most, and how in the aftermath, only questions and grief remain. Case 8. Quinton, Savannah, Georgia, October 5, 2022. What began as a frantic search for a missing toddler would soon unravel into a chilling tale of deception, neglect, and betrayal. Leilani Simon, just 22 years old, called 911 to report that her young son Quinton had vanished from his playpen. The city mobilized. Flyers went up, police scoured neighborhoods. Volunteers combed nearby woods and marshes. But while Savannah searched for answers, the truth was hiding in plain sight. WHO Leilani Simon was raised by a mother struggling with addiction. Leilani spent much of her childhood fending for herself. The cycles of substance abuse, absence, and neglect shaped her teen years and followed her into adulthood. By the time she became a mother herself, Leilani was already fighting her own battles with drugs and unreliable partners. For Quinton, the home that should have been a sanctuary was instead a place of uncertainty and risk. The deception. On the morning of October 5th, something went terribly wrong in the family home. The full truth would only emerge after weeks of investigation, but prosecutors later revealed that Quinton had suffered blunt force trauma. Instead of seeking help, Leilani made a choice that would define everything that followed. She disposed of her son's body in a dumpster, and then called 911. Crying on television, she urged the public, "My son's been through enough. I want my baby home." Behind the scenes, her story was already unraveling. Detectives noticed inconsistencies in her timeline, gaps in her recollection, an absence of evidence suggesting any abduction. Those closest to the family, including Quinton's babysitter, testified to a long history of neglect. Missed meals, unexplained bruises, troubling behavior that had been overlooked too many times. The search for Quinton became a national story. Landfills were combed by hand, searchers sifting through mountains of refuse in hopes of finding even the smallest trace of the little boy. Hundreds of hours, dozens of volunteers, a relentless commitment by law enforcement. On November 18th, after weeks of grueling work, Quinton's remains were finally recovered at the local landfill. The worst fears had been realized. Awe family. Weeks of a city searching, while his mother knew. The trial and verdict. The trial was swift and decisive. Prosecutors charged Leilani Simon with 19 counts, including murder, making false statements, and concealing evidence. Testimony from Quinton's babysitter described previous injuries and repeated attempts to alert authorities, all ignored or dismissed until it was too late. On October 25, 2024, Leilani Simon was convicted on all charges. Prosecutor Tim Dean captured the public mood. Leilani was sorry only for getting caught. On November 21, 2024, she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole plus an additional 10 years. For the community of Savannah, and for those who had searched so desperately for Quinton, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but little comfort. Quinton's memory lives on as a symbol of innocence lost. The safety of our children depends on the strength, courage, and commitment of the adults who are supposed to care for them, especially when life becomes overwhelming.
Truth and evidence.
Crime cases.
Every case has a truth waiting to be exposed.